Picts are ancient people of modern day Scotland, and they were fierce resistance fighters, for example, against Roman occupation. The Hadrian Wall, for example, was built to resist these kind of people. But we know very little about these ancient people, unfortunately. But there are ancient, well, they're not ancient, just early medieval depictions of Pictish crossbows. As you can see on the artwork here, it's very vague. You know it's a D-shaped bow, or perhaps that's the artist's interpretation of the crossbow, but we'll assume it's a D-shaped bow because of the artwork here. And other than that, the trigger isn't shown at all. You know it's a kind of crossbow because of the way it's being spanned by somebody. What was the trigger system? What kind of bow prods they used? The tiller shape, all that. That is very speculative for our modern reproductions. But we can assume a few things. We know around the same time period the Romans had crossbows as well, likely roller nuts based on the archaeological finds. But besides that, I mean, for the Roman crossbow, I made a video about it. They're likely composite prods and likely used by hunters, less used in military context. But in terms of the Pictish crossbows, you can see it's used for hunting, but besides that, it could have been used for military context as well. But besides that, there's very little other information about them. It's hard for us today to kind of reconstruct that, but we can make some educated guesses. So based on the D-shaped prod, it's likely that the prod is made of wood or wood backed with sinew, although we have very little evidence of sinew-backed bows during this time period in Britain. That being said, the Roman auxiliary archers, they were brought from Syria likely, or Cretan archers brought from the Roman Empire. So composite bows were known in Britain, but it's very unlikely the local Picts used composite bows. That being said, I still think, for example, birch bark could have been used for waterproofing their self bows, and that is my interpretation here, because birch bark is quite abundant in Scotland. I've talked to a few Scottish people, and if it's an abundant material, and I've asked about, it's a fairly sacred tree, but the bark would have still been used if it was useful. And I'm sure they knew back then that birch bark is waterproof. So having something that can be waterproof on a bow is quite useful. Some people use beeswax for that purpose, but if you don't have beeswax, well, birch bark is quite abundant. Does it look ugly? I don't think they cared. It was functional. So it is possible that they used birch bark to cover their bows, and that's my interpretation, because if they didn't do that, other waterproofing methods would have likely been more costly and just not practical for the environment they lived in. But I don't think these were horn bows. I highly doubted that. Maybe back with sinew, I doubt it, but just self bows with birch bark is plausible. And as you can see with my birch bark work, it's doesn't need to look pretty, just needs to be functional. And you can see a little bit of horn overlay there to give that reinforcement, and then just cover with birch bark. So it is a modern construction method with a tight bond, epee, and bamboo, but it's a very rugged design. I could have used yew instead, but this is actually from a broken longbow, which I shortened it and returled it. So I'm not, I'm reusing things that broke. So I think that's a better way of using broken bows, is to turn them into crossbows. That's why I used this specific combo of epee and bamboo, just because my bow broke. Now, likely the historical materials they could have used birch, they could have used winch elm, they could have used yew. I'm not sure, we don't know exactly what kind of wood they would have used, and that's all speculative, whatever it was convenient for them. But there are materials available if they wanted. Good bow woods as well. Back then, yew was still quite common because they didn't mass produce yew bows back then. So don't worry about running out of yew in the dark ages. Anyways, in terms of the trigger though, we don't know anything about the triggers. They could be flicker triggers like seen in the African and Vietnamese designs, where you put it in a groove and then you flick it with a lever. Or a Scandinavian design with a push pin, pushes a pin, or the Frankish design, which I'll make a reproduction in the future, is a flicker on the top. These are all possibilities, of course. It could have been a catapult trigger from the Roman design, which would be interesting reproduction to make. Lots of catapults from the scorpions, from for example, the Gastrophetes uses a scorpion trigger. So it could have been that trigger instead. Or it could be a roller nut, like the Roman crossbow reproduction that I made as well. Roller nuts were discovered during this early medieval period, so, and these are organic materials, quite plausible. Whether or not who came up with the roller nut it's difficult to say. It's likely from Europe, but where exactly in Europe, we don't know. But I think all of these possibilities are, I think all of these are possible, but most likely I think the roller nut is the most plausible design. The catapult trigger requires an arsenal to make, the bronze or the metal, or the steel and the iron, and I don't think they would have wasted metal on a trigger when they have, antler available, which is just as functional, but much more abundant for Pictish people. I think the metal, they would rather use that on javelins, swords, and spears instead. That's my logic. So you can make this whole thing out of organic materials without any metal. The trigger bar is a modern metal piece, but the historical one likely would have been antler as well. And this is poplar tiller, and this is from the hardware store. It was from the Roman crossbow that I made. Anyways, in terms of its design, it's almost the exact same as other, like the 12th century medieval crossbows, just a smaller version for hunting purposes. The draw weight's about 120 pounds with a short power stroke like this. This is functioning roughly a 35-pound bow, so nothing fancy. Yeah, I'd love to shoot it and test it out. Now let's talk about the fun stuff. How would the Picts use this kind of crossbow? Well, from the depictions, you're seeing animals, and likely they used it for hunting. And this is much more accurate than an archer because you can wait for the animal and wait for the right time instead of holding the bow at a certain draw length. Instead, you would try to hold it at a certain partial draw, and when you're ready, pull the last few inches. So for ambushing an animal, this is more accurate. Anyways, let's do some shooting. Well, it does shoot, but it's not a powerful crossbow at all. I find with these kind of crossbows, you really have to press down on the string, thumb shooting, so that you prevent dry fire. Of course, making sure the bolt sits on the nut is also important, but there's a lot of fiddling to make sure this does not dry fire. That's why I like the Chinese triggers more. I've actually never dry fired a Chinese trigger. It seems like because I mean, you can have just regular arrow knocks. There you go.